How are the conditions for peace created? The long peace, as it's been termed, the period after World War II, has been characterised by an absence of major conflicts between the most powerful nations of the world, something new in history. There were, of course, some conflicts, most notably the Cold War, but compared with the past, and especially in Europe, the period's stability has been unprecedented. As signs of a cracking in the long peace are starting to appear across the globe, is there anything we can learn from the terms and conditions that set this period in motion? At the end of World War I, the victors, great and supposedly wise statesmen, came together to organise the conditions for peace, and the peace failed. At the end of World War II, the victors squabbled amongst themselves about British imperialism, France's position in the world, the Marshall Plan, the Cominform, the division or unification of Germany, yet the peace lasted. So what characterised those post-war years from around 1945 to 1950 that became responsible for the world we see around us today? The result of World War I was ultimately fascism. The result of World War II was peace. But the conditions in Europe after each war were vastly different. World War I was mostly a military conflict. World War II was total war that engulfed most of the civilian continent. In World War I, 5% of the dead were civilians. In World War II, that number rose to 50%. That meant two things. One, resentment, as I've talked about in a previous video, but also, and more strongly, a desire for peace. As Mark Mazower writes in Dark Continent of the post-war period, people looked forward to building a new world, but they did not wish this process to be disruptive. This naturally led to a decline in ideological belief and the willingness to fight for it. One popular post-war Italian novel, La Donna di Messina, describes a world where ideology loses its appeal and focuses on characters searching for a private life across Italy. Sociologist Jacob Kukiewski has argued that in the case of Poland, although people didn't want to accept Soviet dictatorial rule, and there was of course some resistance, the desire for the reconstruction of homes superseded the desire for self-determination. In much of Western Europe, people retreated from extremes on both sides of the political divide, as political parties aimed for a broad appeal. Even conservative parties like the British Tories and the Christian Democratic parties on the continent adopted redistributive, planning and welfare policies. To most, free market liberalism was as ideologically unappealing as fascism and Marxism. One thing that was uniform across Europe, west or east, was that planning and redistribution of some kind became the status quo. It was clear that it was poverty that led to fascism and communism. So peace and the redistribution of wealth took priority at home, but this still didn't answer the question of how to deal with the defeated Axis countries. Directly after the war, US Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau recommended to President Truman that it should be brought home to the Germans that Germany's ruthless warfare and the fanatical Nazi resistance has destroyed the German economy and made chaos and suffering inevitable, and that the Germans cannot escape responsibility for what they have brought upon themselves. Germany will not be occupied for the purpose of liberation, but as a defeated enemy nation. But this mindset soon gave way to a more practical form of common sense. Soon the Allies realised that the reconstruction of Germany in particular was vital for peace on the continent. If looking after a country's people applied to the people at home, it applied equally to the defeated. The former president Herbert Hoover said to Truman, "You can have vengeance or peace, but you can't have both." German coal was indispensable to French industry. France wanted to build steel plants in the Lorraine region on the eastern border, but needed German coal for them to operate. And for example, up to 1939, over a third of Greece's exports went to Germany, and Greece's imports were about a third German, and 25% of Britain's machine imports had come from Germany. Germany was vital to the continent's economy. So there would be no deindustrialization of Germany, reparations would be fair, and the Marshall Plan, the United States program of grants and aids to rebuild Europe, would apply to West Germany and Italy. When it came to rebuilding democracy, it was dictated to the West Germans that their new constitution had to be democratic in spirit and federal. The rest, though, was ultimately left to them. What was important across Europe were checks and balances that aimed to safeguard against any possible tyranny. The idea of democracy was now an expansive one as compared to 1918. Suffrage almost everywhere became universal, including women for the first time in many countries. Constitutionally, where 1918 focused on the self-determination of nations, 1945 focused on the self-determination of individuals, the protection of individuals against the state, inviolable human rights, as the new German and Italian constitutions put it. Human rights, rather than the rights of the nation, became dominant in political discourse. For the Nazis in particular, World War II had been a fight for a belief in a hierarchy of determined biological types of people. Women belonged in the home, criminals were to be euthanized, certain ethnic groups were unevolved, subhuman. Democracy, one man, one equal vote, depended on the idea of equality between all peoples. The task, though, of introducing democracy into Germany and Italy after the experience of the 1930s was a task that seemed so impossible that most were apathetic or pessimistic about the possibility of its success. Much of the population of Europe thought that another war was inevitable. It always had been. But against all expectations, post-war Europe began to thrive. Between 1913 and 1950, growth in Europe averaged at around 1%. Between 1950 and 1970, that quadrupled to 4%. Between World War I and World War II, gross national product and growth swung wildly between recession and growth. The period after World War II, in comparison, was stable, as was the unemployment rate. Economist Andrew Schonfield attributed the success of capitalism after World War II to the new relationship between public and private power. Many argued that the welfare state and the market economy were mutually necessary. Although, of course, understanding economic success is notoriously difficult and the subject of constant debate, but economists offer a few competing reasons. Labour unions became more powerful, and so the cost of labour stabilised as competition between workers was replaced by the bargaining power of the union. Contracts also became more popular, bringing further stability to employment. And the growth in the government sector and regulation could also have been a factor. Regulation means that others know what to expect when they purchase something. Entrepreneurs, businessmen, investors, they're all more likely to invest under conditions of stability at home or abroad, which is why international organisations and agreements can lead to a more sustainable growth. And against all expectations, by 1950, by many measures, French, Dutch, Austrian, Italian, Greek and Western German economies were at pre-war levels. The Marshall Plan was important to this. but probably only accounted for around 10 to 20% of capital formation in 1945 to 1947, then 10% in the few years after. And all of this led to an economic boom and prosperity on the continent that was unprecedented. So what can we conclude from these conditions for peace? The most stupidly obvious is that war is horrific. And it wasn't that long ago. Public discourse should in some way reflect these facts. Maybe we shouldn't commemorate the dead as much as commemorate the conditions that led to them dying. The second is that a basic level of economic security is needed to avoid the urge towards fascism. Material conditions supersedes ideology. The third, in the case of German Reconstruction in particular, but Europe in general especially, is that economies are interconnected. Isolationism isn't a long-term answer. International agreements are fundamental. The historian Tony Judt sums all this up in Postwar. He writes, "The missed opportunities after 1918, the Great Depression that followed the stock market crash of 1929, the waste of unemployment, the inequalities, injustices and inefficiencies of laissez-faire capitalism that had led so many into authoritarian temptation, the brazen indifference of an arrogant ruling elite and the incompetence of an inadequate political class all seem to be connected by the utter failure to organise society better." There are other possibilities that underpin the causes of peace. Nuclear weapons of course stop countries from going to war, while some theorists of international relations claim a bipolar world with power shared between two superpowers is more stable than a unipolar or multipolar world. And others claim that the idea of a long peace is a fallacy, citing civil wars, Western neo-imperialism, and repression within Soviet states and satellites. But given that the long peace, whether you believe in the extent of it or not, closed the most horrific war in history, yet led to probably the most unexpected economic boom in history, there have to be some lessons we can learn from it. We might all draw different lessons, but for my money it's this. In the long term we are only as strong as our weakest neighbour, and the well-being of that neighbour's poorest citizens, and our own, is fundamental to warding off the always present fascist threat. If you want to support Then and Now, then please subscribe below, and most importantly, click the bell here to receive notifications when I upload a new video. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram in the links in the description below, and if you're feeling really generous, then this channel only exists through the support of pledges on Patreon, where you can support new content with as little as $1 for each new video. Thanks for watching, see you next week.